20. Pleasure versus fulfillment. You're entirely bonkers, but I'll tell you a secret. All the best people are. Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. Drug addiction is a symptom of the disease of unfulfillment. Happiness and fulfillment are different. Happiness is an emotional sense of pleasure. Pleasures are transient and incomplete. Fulfillment is an emotional and intellectual feeling of being whole and complete. Fulfillment has longevity. Happiness is featured within fulfillment, but fulfillment is not necessarily a feature of happiness. Pleasure, happiness, appeals to your senses, but fulfillment appeals to your spirit. To feel happy, we must acquire and experience, but to feel fulfilled, we must achieve and accomplish. Fulfillment goes deep as it continues to evolve after the actual event that began it. So long as anyone remains devoid of feeling fulfilled, they will unconsciously seek simple pleasures as an alternative. Drugs, sex, food. Once fulfillment is experienced, it becomes the priority and totally eclipses the desire for pleasure or happiness. Discovering fulfillment requires the same effort and experimentation as seeking pleasure does. However, it takes more patience and endurance. Pleasures abound, they're common, but fulfillment is specific and precise and requires perseverance and tenacity. As you contemplate and search for fulfillment experiences, consider these qualifications. Does it require sacrifice to accomplish? Does it appeal to the emotion and mind or just the senses? Is there a sense of actual passion regarding it? Does it affect other living things in a positive way? These are a few common ingredients of fulfilling endeavors. Fulfillment, the cure for addiction and pleasure seeking. Addiction is often a coping mechanism used to compensate for a biochemical deficiency or some previously experienced trauma, such as abuse, pain, or shame. An addiction is used as a tool to escape from or avoid the memory or awareness of some prior trauma. This is true, but we can add a finer dimension to it. I was never traumatized, and yet I am an addict. I've always sensed that life, even when luxurious and happy, has a nagging limitation to it. And no matter what I acquire, I will eventually realize that all I acquire is so futile. Complacency is an inevitability to pleasure. When I was first exposed to helping others and creating something personal and meaningful, I felt whole, complete, deep. I realized what I truly craved and needed was the untapped and dormant potential to make a contribution to the world in some way. I personally need to serve others and humanity to feel fulfillment. We all need to feel fulfilled. If we don't feel fulfilled, we will seek pleasure as a convenient substitute. The panacea to drugs is to heed the calling of your spirit, to contribute in some way. Be a help, not a hindrance, or even just neutral. We're either part of the problem or part of the solution. How do we hear the call of our spirit? Meditate, pray, seek, want, and need it as bad or even more deeply than you want dope, ice cream, or money, and it will reveal itself. The answer is inside, deep in your heart, spirit, and mind. The answer is there. We don't need to create it or have it created. We need to uncover it. Allow yourself to need it and beg for it to be revealed to you. It already belongs to you, so you don't need to get permission to view it. It's yours. Go toward the silence inside. Quiet the outer world and its BS, brainwashing and subterfuge. Don't seek it, allow it. I know, it sounds cryptic and ethereal. I assure you, it only seems that way because we try to view or touch it with conventional seeing or touching. Feel your way. Don't touch or smell or see it. Those senses have often misled you. Your brain will mislead you too. You think with your brain, but you feel with your mind. Brain and mind are different. Brain is tissue and it is body and it is human. But mind is spirit, thought, and feeling, and it is very near to soul. Get beyond yourself. 21. Spirituality and recovery. Why is a raven like a writing desk? Said the Mad Hatter. I haven't the slightest idea, said Alice. Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. God is extreme. God is so far beyond our intellect, reason, or senses that a powerful, phenomenal experience is often required to gain insight and understanding of Him. Him is a conventional term. We'll assume God is genderless. Without such an experience, we simple humans are so easily distracted by the features of this material world that we can be oblivious to a truly great, peaceful, and absolute presence. Human beings are stubborn. You'll find no atheists in foxholes is an aphorism implying that everyone finds God when they are faced with the inevitability of their death. When faced with our own mortality, an innate need to live on pervades our consciousness, and we become desperate to make sense of our lives. Is sudden faith in a spiritual entity irrational thinking brought on by desperation? Or does the intensity and magnitude of our mortality coming fully into focus make us totally vulnerable and accepting? Vulnerable is synonymous with innocence, and innocence is synonymous with humility. Desperation forces us to abandon the sense that superficial and material needs are critical to our identities and fulfillment. They suddenly seem small and unimportant. In this vulnerable desperation, we are like children, raw and uncomplicated, innocent and honest. It takes this true level of true, honest sincerity to even begin to experience the grace of the divine. "Suffer the little children unto me" is a quote from Jesus in the Gospels that refers to the state of innocence that is needed to experience God's love. His love is always present and omnipresent, yet we are largely incapable of perceiving it as we cling to our desires, our pride, and our sense of self. Grace surrounds us always, and it is merely our own imperfections and limitations that obstruct our perception of it. To have the spiritual experience, we need to be raw, innocent, vulnerable, and most of all, humble. When a person tells me about an extraordinary good experience, like winning the lottery, they often praise God for His grace and intervention. It is common to see an athlete score a goal and thank God. My overly inquisitive mind can't help but wonder if this means God is against the other team. I mean, if He favored one team or player scoring or winning, doesn't that imply that He's against the other team? Isn't that contradictory to God's nature, which is to love indiscriminately and unconditionally? When people survive, persevere, or experience something exceptionally favorable, it seems easy to acknowledge God's involvement. Yet, when they experience misfortune and adversity, He is either not acknowledged at all or is invoked only for salvation or rescue. The truly spiritual personalities of history were mindful and grateful to God all the time, not only when extraordinary things occurred. Spiritual personalities are ever mindful and conscious of God's presence in their lives, and they recognize that everything occurring is extraordinary. When Francis of Assisi was set upon by robbers and beaten within an inch of his life and thrown into a ditch to die, he began singing God's praises, completely mindless and uncaring of his broken, injured, and dying state. He was oblivious to his condition, simply forgetting about it as he began to ponder God, which evoked him to spontaneously sing loudly and cheerfully. This singing got a passerby's attention, but Francis cared not a bit about being rescued or saved. He was completely absorbed in a devotional state of consciousness. He was 100% totally and completely happy as he lay there, physically dying. All of the historical saints were absorbed in devotional consciousness, and most of them were thought to be insane by their contemporaries, since they sang, danced, and acted so unconventionally that it was hard to accept them by societal standards. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu in India in 1400s, St. Francis of Assisi in the 1100s, Gautama Buddha in 500 BC, and many other spiritual personalities had followers and devotees, but were mostly shunned and thought of as controversial, radical, and even insane by many of their contemporaries. It is now understood and believed that these personalities were in such a high state of God consciousness that they were blissful and ecstatic in ecstasy. Being blissful will make you seem a bit weird to a culture whose values are material success, health, and mundane happiness. Even those seeking spiritual happiness are rarely spiritually evolved enough to respect and appreciate true states of ecstatic spiritual consciousness when witnessing them. What's God? So, what or who is God? If we agree that God exists, we'll need to agree on some definitions to His nature. Omnipresent, omniscient, eternal, infinite, perfect, exponential bliss. We cannot truly conceptualize these qualities as they are far beyond our comprehension. We have limited material minds, and God exists so far beyond the material that we simply do not have the equipment to even understand the divine beyond a crude concept. We use words that express or mean things, but they're merely words used on an ineffable subject. Similarly, when a pregnant woman tries to describe what it's like to be pregnant to a man or a woman who's never been pregnant, the best she can do is provide metaphors to express the experience. As she does so, the listener gives facial expressions of recognition and says, I see, yes, I get it. But she knows they cannot possibly truly get it. To discuss the God and faith thing, we will use words and metaphors to attempt to get as close as our puny little human minds can get. Omnipresent, everywhere at once, in all places at all times. Our existence is spot existent, meaning we exist in a single spot at any given moment. But God's presence is omnipresent. Now we have the definition, but truly try to imagine being everywhere all at once. Can't really do it, huh? Makes your brain start to hurt. Omniscient, has awareness and total understanding of absolutely everything. Everything you think, feel, and do, and that goes for the entire other 7 billion people on the planet, and even the animals, ants, and other insects too. This includes everything that has ever happened, everything that can happen, and everything that ever will happen. We exist in a state of eternal present, meaning we can imagine a future and we remember a past, but we always exist in the now. The past and the future are remote and abstract. Eternal. There is no start or finish. Something eternal has always been and always will be. Literally, always. We cannot relate. Infinite. Absolutely no boundary or limit. Combine the first three together and you get infinite. Something infinite has no beginning or end to its presence or being. Not because it is too expansive to calculate, but because it is neither large nor tiny. It is absolutely beyond even the concept of space or measurement. Space does not apply to it. It is neither hot nor cold, nor young nor old. It is all and everything all at once. Perfect. Perfect, by definition, is not imperfect and cannot possibly have even a single imperfect quality by any standard. Perfect is not open to opinion or perspective. It is absolute. It is impossible to say what perfect is. The best we can do is say what it is not. God is bliss. This is a feature of being totally perfect because it is not possible for anything perfect to be anything less than. We'll use the example of water again. Water is wet, not partially or somewhat or sort of or kind of. It is wet. It is perfectly wet because wet is its nature. Now, water is perfectly wet, but it is not perfect because wet is all it is. To be perfect, it needs to be all other things as well as itself. God is not a part of all things, but is all things. Even simultaneously, He is perfectly wet and perfectly dry and perfectly everything else too. Perfect everything is synonymous with being bliss, not blissful, because the full part implies possession, and God doesn't possess anything as He already is absolutely everything. Exponential. God's blissful quality is exponential. Exponential is something that increases and expands upon itself and by itself. As it expands, its own increased mass activates expansion to an even bigger mass, which goes on and on. It is self-perpetuating. God's bliss, His personality, and all His qualities are ever increasing. This is not a book about spirituality or religion, so this section is merely to encourage spirituality as one of the many modalities we can use in recovery. Spiritually minded people will always feel it is a cornerstone of their recovery and success and will not require any encouragement here. However, people with dominantly scientific, logical, and practical backgrounds may not gravitate easily to spirituality, and this section is presented to encourage spiritual exploration and experiment. As with every strategy, absolutely everything should be evaluated and considered before it is rejected, and hopefully at least one or a combination of several of them will contribute to overall progress and success. Cultivating spirit. Whether spirituality is a consistent feature of our lives or it isn't, what follows are ways to begin or enhance this consistency. It makes no difference where we are in spiritual practice, as the steps and practices are the same for everyone at every stage of spirituality. The only difference between novices and veterans is the inner experience and how well they may perform their practice. The practice actions are nearly the same for everyone. In the same way, both a young football player and a professional player both kick the ball when it comes. The only real difference is the results, as a professional player may kick a goal and a new young player may kick the ball and miss a lot. The basic function and action is the same for both. Kick the ball. However, seasoning and experience make all the difference. The same with spirituality. We get better at it and have a better experience with it when we practice more. Adjust your expectations, as it definitely takes time to experience and have awareness of spiritual benefits. The incentives are clear. Over time, our inner experience should be an increase of the following: peace, fulfillment, wholeness, compassion and sympathy, humbleness, devotion, spiritual love, which is qualitatively different than any form of worldly love. Spiritual exercise and commitment are not religion specific. The main feature and quality to cultivate spirituality is simple: devotion. Feeling gratitude and appreciation for the divine is what devotion is. When we feel truly and sincerely grateful and appreciative for anything, we have an inner need to serve it. Spiritual service is done in any of three ways: action, material, and emotional. Action is to practice your spiritual path with some commitment and discipline. Church on Sundays, or as often as you can, even if it is only one Sunday a month. Regular meditation and or prayer. Try to discipline yourself to have routine, i.e. every evening before dinner, or 10 minutes, or every morning for 30 minutes before coffee. The rearranging of other responsibilities and duties to practice is an act of spiritual devotion, as you are saying to the divine that your spiritual growth and commitment is something you will rearrange things for. God is listening to that message, and He sees it, and it draws Him closer. Read your spiritual books, scriptures, poetry, stories, or any material that causes you to be spiritually conscious. Watch a speech or a presentation, or even a movie that is focused on spiritual ideas and concepts. Be conscious of the messages in these actions, and don't settle for merely being entertained by them. Whether we are meditating or watching a movie, the essential part is to try to be mindful of the divine while doing it. Thinking of God with gratitude for all His powers, virtues, and involvement is just one way to be spiritually conscious. But we can also think of how God is mystifying and how we don't really understand Him or even know what to think. Thinking of the divine in any way is better than not thinking of the divine. Material service can be charitable work or simply being gracious, sensitive, kind, or polite to others. We can volunteer to help our church or spiritual center, or we can donate money or bring some food. The spectrum is wide, and it matters more what our heartfelt intention is. If a poor man puts a nickel in the donation cup at a church and it's all he has, it is equal to the $100 given by a rich man, so long as both are given with sincerity and devotion. Both of these donations exceed the spiritual devotion of the man who gives $100,000 merely to get praise or to feel important. It is the intention that makes an action valuable, not the action itself. It's the thought that counts. A material action is converted to a spiritual action by intent. Any material action done with the hope of pleasing or serving God becomes devotional and spiritual. A good action without God in mind is merely a good action. Sweeping the floor is converted to a spiritual act if it is done with God in mind while it's being done. Emotional devotional. Emotional devotional service is thinking of the divine affectionately. Longing for spirituality or desiring to be more capable and spiritually evolved is spiritual devotion. Longing for the divine and spiritual experience is a way of expressing your love. It isn't possible for you to miss something without craving its association. If I miss my son or my girlfriend, it's because I love them, and longing is a manifestation of that love. If no one ever missed us, we would feel sad and unwanted. Longing for the divine is a highly evolved virtue. I can testify that the more you think of the divine and the more you long for it, the closer the divine comes to you and the closer you are to it. When I miss my loved ones, it is bittersweet. It is painful to be separated from them, but simultaneously brings me closer emotionally to them. Because they are human beings with material minds, they are unaware of my longing for them. But God is omniscient, so He knows you are longing for Him. Go to church. Go to a meditation center that puts emphasis on God. Take time to pray and meditate. Do your chores or work, and every hour, pause and think of the wonder, the majesty of the divine. Eat dinner, play a game, clean the dishes, ride your bike. It makes no difference what you do. If you have your mind even remotely thinking of the divine, you are doing a spiritual practice, and practice makes perfect. God does not hate or inflict pain. He is unconditional, absolute love. Try to imagine that, truly unconditional. Some tried and tested practices. Be grateful to be aware of your faults and defects. Be thankful to have the intellect to consider your faults and the willingness to acknowledge and try to work on them. When thoughts come to mind of how afflicted you are and how painful life can be, remind yourself that if not for God's grace, it would be worse. If I do not learn or grow from my suffering, it is a waste. Suffering is a teacher. Be grateful He is teaching you. Set your phone or watch alarm to go off every half hour or so as a reminder to think of the divine, even if it's simply a superficial awareness for just a moment. Dedicate your actions, eating, sleeping, walking, to the divine, simply taking a moment to acknowledge divine presence and commit whatever you are doing or about to do to the divine. Again, it makes no difference if it seems superficial or not. Having God in mind during an action is all that matters. It makes no difference what religion or philosophy you adhere to, so long as you adhere to the divine principle that derives it and you do it with sincerity and devotion. Follow your religion's rules or your philosophy's instructions as closely as you can, but most of all, do it with an inner desire to be closer to and to know the divine better. Beg the divine to reveal itself to you in your mind or emotions. Even demand it. Try to resist the impulse to ask God for a relief of a particular set of circumstances or problems. If the divine reveals itself in your heart and mind, it won't make a difference whether those conditions exist or not. You'll be so content within. For example, say you ask a guy who's stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic why he's smiling so much, and he says, "You kidding? I just won 10 grand in the lottery." He does not care and is not perturbed by the traffic outside because he's content and happy within his mind. The outside world matters less, or maybe not at all, if we are truly, truly happy within our spirit. Refrain from asking God to intervene on your life circumstances and ask Him to assist your ability to be aware of His presence. It's not about Him revealing Himself. He is omnipresent and is not hiding. He does not need to reveal Himself. We need to remove the material perceptions in our way. Ramakrishna Paramahansa was a spiritually enlightened man at the turn of the century with no education, who could not read or write, and yet he had spiritually inspired hundreds of intellectuals during his life. Ramakrishna had contracted brain cancer that was killing him and eventually took his life. He was asked by one of his disciples, "Master, you're enlightened and can call on God to spare you all the suffering in an instant, so why don't you?" He answered, "Why would I take my mind from loving God for even a moment for something so insignificant?" He was so absorbed in his love for God, he was ecstatic. Brain cancer and painful physical suffering was not worth even pausing in his devotional love for God. For him, if he even paused in loving God for a moment, that would be true suffering. His body and brain discomfort were insignificant in comparison. Like St. Francis being left for dead in the ditch, singing out God's praises, they were both so absorbed in loving God, they could not think of anything else. You may have noticed that there is no clinical or practical recovery discipline here. It is not necessary to put our spirituality in the context of recovery. If we are spiritually fulfilled, we will desire nothing, not even and especially drugs.